Now, you may be asking yourself, why have I zeroed in on the transcendental arguments? The transcendental argument, there's a reason I've zeroed in on it. It is an extraordinarily powerful tool in your toolkit for the practicing apologist that has been, as of this hearing, completely underutilized by the Christian community. If you know anything about the history of philosophy, Kant specifically designed, I don't know if he actually invented the transcendental arguments. They may be able to be traced back to Aristotle. I'm not sure. Not an expert on Kant, not an expert on Aristotle. But it was specifically, if there's one philosopher who influences the atheist community the most to this day, that would be Hume. The only philosopher Matt Dillahunty ever cites is Hume. If he's ever read any philosopher in full, that would be the only one. I doubt he's read him in full, but he's the only one he ever cites outside of Occam's razor that's just about the sum total bread and butter of his epistemology. Now, that's true for a lot of atheists, heavily influencing the atheist community to this day. Humean skepticism. Now, it's a powerful line of argumentation, but it's already been powerfully dealt with by Kant. Part of the reason why people don't know this as well as they should, and this is just my own little pet theory, but I think it's because Kant is so notoriously hard to understand. But he's already basically dealt with Humean skepticism. That was half the point of his magnum opus Critique of Pure Reason. He even said out of his own mouth, Hume awoke me from my dogmatic slumber, meaning I got to deal with Hume. And he did. And in so doing, he has fashioned out an argument called the Transcendental Argument. And it is an extraordinarily powerful tool of inference being completely underutilized by the Christian community. Now, it's possible the pre-suppers have given it a bad name and brought it into disrepute, but it is trying to re-examine the tool and see how it works and use it. Why it's a tool of inference? Very simple. Why? First of all, let's start at the beginning. What was Kant trying to do? If you know anything about the history of philosophy, you know anything about Hume, in Hume's epistemology, there's something called Hume's fork. Hume's fork is really simple, but it's potentially problematic for a couple of different reasons. Hume's fork is you have two things in epistemology: matters of fact and relation of things. Math would fall under the category of relation of things. Relation of things is basically stuff that doesn't fall into matters of fact that people would consider true by definition. So if I say all criminals are lawbreakers, that's true. Why? Because it's true by definition. So into that category, he would put math. Now, Kant intuited that correctly that this was not quite good enough. So if you know anything about Kant, and I'm going to try to avoid Kantian jargon, why I think it's confusing, I'm almost positive that's why, as influential as Kant is, I think Kant could have been a lot more influential. That's just my own pet theory. I could be wrong about that. But for example, you may have heard the term and don't really understand what a synthetic a priori is. It is basically a synthesis of matters of the thing that Kant was trying to deal with. So you had two schools of philosophy prior to Kant. He was trying to synthesize the two. Okay, you had the empiricists, a la Hume, which is still influencing the atheist community to this day, and what they called the rationalists. And what he was specifically trying to do was find a way of justifying really synthetic a prioris is something in between matters of fact and relation of things. Relation of thing is completely incomplete. And this is what the transcendental argument is born out of. So, what is a transcendental argument in a nutshell? X is a necessary precondition of Y, therefore X. Now, think it through, it's actually a really powerful tool of induction or deduction that is being really underutilized by the Christian community. So, what does it actually mean? If let's say, for example, in the simplest form, let's say my wife calls me up. And the reason why I'm zeroing in on it is something I've said time and time again. Metaphysical a priori assumptions are the entirety of the ballgame. The entirety of the ballgame. By the time you have a resurrection debate, you against Pine Creek Doug, me against Pine Creek Doug, you are viewing the data points from entirely different paradigms of reality. He, firmly embedded, is viewing the data point from a completely different metaphysical a priori assumption that he is firmly committed to about the nature of the world we live in, that in Pine Creek Doug, for example, is pretty resolute. It isn't resolute in every atheist under the sun, wherein he has already decided prior to the debate, do you see why it's important? That the supernatural does not occur. If you were charged with convincing him of the reality of God at all, you have to get at that prior first. First, before you present the facts of the resurrection. Why? Because by definition, it is going to seem 1,000 times more plausible to a naturalist, a natural explanation. They don't believe in the possibility of the supernatural explanation. You have to weaken that commitment first. Do you get it? You have to weaken that prior metaphysical commitment. That's the most important part. And that's why I've been discussing how you get people to flip priors, because you parse out the data points based on different paradigms of reality. The pre-suppers are 100% correct about that. And there are the transcendental argument was discovered by Kant. It is a tool of inference that is actually how we formulate a lot of our coherent thoughts about the world. Why X is a necessary, oftentimes X is a necessary precondition of Y. So we find out about X and we go, therefore Y. So let me give you an example just in normal life that underscores. I'll give you two examples. Let's say my wife calls me up from Pacific Palisades. She's driving around, and let's just say for argument's sake, I don't know any of the stores in Pacific Palisades. She goes, do you want something from the Vons? Okay, normal inference, which would be pretty much correct 80 to 90% of the time. There's a Vons in Pacific Palisades. Why? She wouldn't be asking me the question if there wasn't a Vons for her to go and buy me something from. So a necessary precondition of that question making sense, I'm just assuming she saw the Vons there. I don't generally, are you sure there's a Vons there, sweetie? It's not a big deal. I just assume that she knows that there's a Vons there, but that's a necessary precondition of that question even making any sense whatsoever. We draw inferences in the transcendental way all the freaking time. It's basically how we formulate most of our sense-making apparatus in this world. It's the biggest thing that we do. We draw inferences. Based on what? Based on necessary preconditions. We automatically plug in a presupposition, and we do it automatically. So I wouldn't even ask her. She said, do you want something from Vons? I wouldn't even go like, do you have any evidence that there's a Vons there, sweetheart? I wouldn't even think about that. I just, get me Cheetos and a cool movie from the Red Box. Do anybody still use those anymore? I still use them. Actually, I haven't since COVID. Okay, so it is completely logically rational to infer propositional content based off an experience. Let's say, for example, another one. Now let's say a cat walks into my apartment. I've mentioned this in the other video. And let's just say for argument's sake, I don't have a cat. And I'm sitting in the living room and I see a cat run by me in the living room. First, most logical thing I'm going to conclude, how did a cat get in the apartment? All things being equal, let's say I've got enough sleep, I'm not drunk. If it's you, put yourself in this situation. It's the one day of the week you're not drunk, you're not stoned for some mysterious reason. I don't know, maybe your dealer was out of town. So you're just sitting there completely sober, had enough sleep, and a cat runs by. What's the first most logical inference you're going to draw from that experience, propositional content-wise? How did a cat get in the apartment? There's a cat in the apartment. The cat scurries under the bed. It is completely reasonable for you to infer a necessary precondition of you seeing the cat in the apartment is there's a freaking cat running around your bedroom, right? Unless you're hallucinating. So your wife comes home, you go, honey bunny, look under the bed. She looks under the bed. She goes to you, hey, how did a cat get in the apartment? Now you're almost positive there's a cat in the apartment. Why? Normal inference. And it's been correlated with another person outside of you, so there's almost no chance you're hallucinating. People don't share hallucinations. So there's a cat in your apartment. Normal inference. Runs out the door. Okay, Pine Creek can't come along a little bit later and jujitsu you. Why? The inference you drew off of your experience is completely rational, completely normal, automatically and logically follows almost, there's a chance you may be wrong, but the chances under which you and your wife would both be wrong would be like maybe it was a robot cat that the neighbor built. There's some sort of really weird, out-of-the-box sort of other explanation. Other than that, the inference you draw almost always, you automatically draw metaphysical a priori assumptions, and they make a lot of coherent sense. They're not always right. Why? Because you don't always have enough information to draw the correct ones. But they're extraordinarily important. And you draw them automatically. The difference between, I'll get into this in detail in maybe the later part of the video, if not another video. I've already explained the only way you get people to flip their priors is two ways. Planting of seeds and propaganda, which is in essence the same thing. Propaganda is you get people to draw inferences, truck in inferences that don't logically follow or automatically apply. That is why they say in politics to go negative. What are you doing? You're trying to get people to infer something. That candidate is a scalawag. Based on what? Information. Based on he associated with this guy and this guy and this guy, and those are scalawags. Ergo, he's a scalawag. Yeah, go look it up, a word for the glossary. So you get the whole point. Now let's go back to Hume for a sec, because I gotta elaborate on this. Hume had two things, two ways in his epistemology. His epistemology was incomplete. It was matters of fact and relation of things. Relation of things means true by definition. Herein lies the problem. And this, Kant was trying to deal with Hume. Kant didn't even anticipate this. This problem was really big, almost destroyed mathematics, and it was discovered by Bertrand Russell. Discovered. It's a key word. Hold on to that idea. He didn't invent this problem. He discovered this problem. That's a key concept. Bertrand, some of you probably know what the liar's paradox is. If you don't, okay, oh, here they come again. If you do not know what the liar's paradox is, remember, the true by definition are relation of ideas. So listen to the liar's paradox. This statement is false. Am I telling the truth or am I lying? You're lying, Craig. I'm lying. So the statement is true, that the statement is false. You see the problem? It's like a who's on first for the smart set. Yes, you're lying. The statement is therefore true that the statement is false. Huh? Who's on first for the philosophical set? It's actually a real paradox. Why? Because it annihilates the concept of true by definition. It's true by definition that what? The statement is false, therefore true, therefore false, therefore true. It doesn't work. And Bertrand Russell noticed that it could be applied to mathematics. Sets in particular. I forget the exact way that he... I forget the exact mechanism, but you can do the exact same thing with sets. You can say this set contains everything outside of this set, or something like that. And it's basically the liar's paradox applied to mathematics. It caused a crisis in mathematics, almost destroyed the foundations of mathematics. What Kant is ostensibly trying to do is he recognized the incompleteness of the true by definition, and he was trying to ground it in something more empirical, or more robust, so that we can actually conclude. And he actually succeeded. The transcendent argument really works, and it's a powerful tool of inference being completely underutilized by the Christian community. X is a necessary precondition to Y, therefore X. My wife cannot go into a Vons and get me toilet paper if there isn't a Vons in the town. Therefore, a necessary precondition of that statement being intelligible is there's got to be a Vons there. So I just assume or presuppose that there's a Vons in the town. Otherwise, my wife is weird or wrong or crazy. There's no Vons there, sweetheart. But the necessary precondition of us seeing the cat, or one potential really strong, I said two people saw the cat. So there's really strong, compelling evidence for a cat being in the apartment, which would be a necessary precondition of us having the experience. So to draw inferences from experience is completely reasonable. The only time it is accepting the times where they are propaganda inferences that people try and truck in inferences that don't logically follow and automatically apply. Now, the big problem with true by definition, as I just explained, the liar's paradox. The liar's paradox actually annihilates the whole concept of true by definition, and it almost took math out of the realm of, it caused a huge crisis in math. That's where Gordo came along with the incompleteness theorem, to ground math in something other than just true by definition. And the problems that we are working on right here, right now, for the purposes of evidencing the sky fairy, have been solved or handled by philosophers prior to us in really compelling ways. We just don't know this. We just don't know it well enough to bring these arguments out in the cold light of day. That's why I started digging into them. The one thing that the atheists always ask you, do you have evidence? What do they mean? Empirical evidence for your sky fairy. Okay, here's the problem with evidentiary apologetics. Only gets you so far. Why? The thing I'm ostensibly trying to evidence for, the supernatural, stands outside the purview, outside of the realm of natural experience, hence outside of the purview of empirical investigation. Oh, yeah, potentially a really big problem. Potentially a really big problem. The other problem is the person who you're trying to evidence to is presupposing a world completely different than you, presupposing an entire reality and galaxy of experiences completely different than you. It's as if you walk in two separate universes, and you have to bridge that chasm before you even begin the conversation. Do you understand? The reason why Pine Creek never asked me a question about my ostensibly spiritual experiences or supernatural experiences is because he didn't think he had to. Why the supernatural does not occur is really resolute in his brain. Part of the reason why there aren't that many atheists out there, even though there are a lot of nons, and I've said this a lot, but if you're an atheist, you should pay attention to this. Why? Because this is a really insightful statement. You rejoice at people quitting church and go, oh my God, there's so many nons. Do not. Go talk to the nons. Why? Most of them believe in God really easily. They aren't atheists. Atheism, even in today's world, is still somewhat rare. Why do nons readily and easily believe in God? Because they've had supernatural experiences or something akin to supernatural experiences that it's really hard for them to account for. That's one reason. The other reason is they have no particular, the huge chunk of it is this bias against, the atheists spend a lot of time propagandizing against what it entails to be a religious person. It means you're crazy, you're irrational, you're this, you're that. They spend a lot of time on that propaganda wheel. Why? So they automatically draw an inference about, that's why they get so defensive. If it were just the parsing out of the evidence, okay, the evidence is somewhat inconclusive, but there's a lot of things that we can carve out a negotiated compromise. It's easy for me to carve out a negotiated compromise with any reasonable atheist under the sun and say, these things are not in dispute, these things are settled matters of fact, and here's the disputed territory. And you'd find very few things in the disputed territory. The things that I'm trying to account for are in the disputed territory. And there are ways to account them other than evidentiary. Why? Evidentiary gets you up to the realm of natural, and it doesn't transverse the realm from the natural to the supernatural. You need some sort of connecting agent. That's why I stumbled upon math. Why? Because math is that connecting agent. Again, go back to the original thing I said 3 or 4 videos ago. If an atheist is willing to grant you a starting point, yes, the laws of logic exist. There are 2 transcendental categories. There's 10 that Kant used. We only need 2. Laws of logic and mathematical axioms. If the atheist is willing to grant you the starting point, yes, the laws of logic exist. They are invisible, immaterial, transcendent, and inviolate. Okay, he's just given you a starting point that is somewhere between atheism and theism. Actually, why didn't he just admit to the existence of God? Look at what he said. And Matt Dillahunty said this twice, and most atheists will grant you the starting point. Yes, the laws of logic exist. They're invisible, immaterial, transcendent, and inviolate. Why didn't he just admit to some type of God? Not quite the omni-God of the Bible, not quite Jesus Christ, hallelujah to the Lamb of God. Now, here's the only objection that makes sense. There's 2 objections that I've heard from atheists, and both of these I've heard from the mouths of atheists. One, the laws of logic are descriptive, not prescriptive. That's ridiculous. They're prescriptive or they wouldn't work as rules of inference. That's false. 2, the one Dr. Matthew Hunt said in my response to when I brought this up the first time. The laws of logic are psychological tools of inference only, ergo, not outside, extant to the human being, interior. They are rules of inference for, parsing out logical thought. They aren't outside of the human being. Okay, potentially a very valid objection, actually. And I'm pretty sure, I'm not an expert on Kant, but I'm pretty sure Kant thought of his transcendental categories as just rules of inference internal to a human being. That is why I said there are 2 transcendent categories you need to latch onto. Logic and math. Now we get to the interesting part. Why? Because depending on your philosophy of math, you only have three possible options: mathematical Platonist, mathematical nominalist, or mathematical fictionalist. As I've explained in other videos, mathematical fictionalism is incoherent. Mathematical Platonism, and it's a mainstream position in physics. Okay, the most famous physicists, the two most famous physicists alive today are Penrose and Carlo Rovelli. Penrose is very famously a mathematical Platonist. It is a mainstream position in modern physics that math is a discovered truth extant to the human being, outside of the human being. A discovered truth about the nature of reality. Why is that important? Because it's theism by a different name. Bang, got you. Yeah, it is. Really think about what he's saying. That they're outside of the human being, there stands a transcendent, immaterial, invisible thing other than the natural world that doesn't sound suspiciously to you like God. That's not a rule of inference. I get why the law of logic can be just a psychological rule of inference, but if you're a mathematical Platonist, you are already admitting to something that is very close in spirit to theism. It is a theism by another name, if you ask me. You say, well, I don't accept that, Craig. Why? I get that you're not going to accept it, but you're going to have to ask yourself why you don't accept it. And I'm not saying that this is, keep your ties in your pocket, keep your ties sheathed. I'm not saying this is the argument. I'm just saying this is the direction that the argument is taking. Okay, I'm an anomalist. Okay, a nominalist. My definition of a nominalist is better than most. Why? Because the nominalist is ostensibly ascribing some reality to the transcendent realm with certain qualifiers and preconditions. That's my definition. You won't find that anywhere else. I think that's better than every other one. Because nominalists are not mathematical fictionalists. They do think mathematical truths are true to a reference point, which gets us to, I don't think I'm getting too complicated. If I'm getting too complicated, got to slow down, let me know. I don't think I am, so I'll just plow through. Let's go back to the crisis in mathematics was perpetrated by the idea that, math was contingent on true by definition, relation of ideas. It precipitated a crisis. Why? Because I told you about the liar's paradox. That basically knocks out the whole idea of true by definition. Because something can be true by definition, then false, then true, then false, then true, then false. It doesn't make any sense. Mathematics almost destroyed itself. There was a real crisis in mathematics, just as there's a crisis today, some would say, in physics. And it started with quantum mechanics. And as I've argued, there's no crisis there. The only crisis is, as we enter the 20th century, physicists stopped doing philosophy and stopped doing metaphysics by choice. They said, those are archaic, outmoded ways of thinking. And the whole argument I've been making the whole time is that metaphysics and philosophy are coming back into vogue. Okay, they trended away for the beginning of the 20th century, so you had something known as the rational smart set guy, circa 1909, was a physicalist / materialist. He said matter and motion is all there is. We're done with metaphysics. Why smart people don't do that speculation anymore. We're done with philosophy. What do I care what some guy in a toga said 2,000 years ago? I'm interested in science. Now, we still have scientism is today. And if you notice, their thoughts are incoherent. Why? All philosophy needs to mean is an interpretive framework. So when I say interpretations of quantum mechanics and philosophy, that is a tool of philosophy being applied to science. Scientists do it all the time. They borrow the tools of the philosopher and they apply it to science. There is no such thing as the philosophy that we're done with philosophy. Why? Because we're so smart, we're scientists. It is self-refuting and idiotic, and it's starting to evaporate. Once it evaporates, bye-bye a huge chunk of atheists. Why? Because natural starting point, as I've said in the other videos, and people didn't hear this clearly. I said, Craig said a scientismist and an atheist are synonymous. No, I didn't. I said scientism and reductive materialism are two building blocks from which atheism almost logically and automatically follows. You get rid of those two building blocks, you prove them false. It's a much better route to getting people to see the beauty of your sky fairy than working on them from a different direction. Why? Because the undergirdings, the things that build atheism, the normal presuppositions that entail atheism, Atheism's not a worldview. I understand it's not a worldview. It's not a belief either. That one I don't get. Okay, all right, whatever. It's not a belief. All right, whatever. It's a superposition beyond all. The normal building blocks of the atheist that naturally produce atheism: physicalism/materialism and scientism, both of which were heavily pronounced in the 20th century. Other than that, it is not really that natural for people to stumble upon atheism. It's not. Throughout history, atheism is a relatively rare position. Okay, even today, with most people in the world who are relatively well educated would say that one of those two are true. Most people would say materialism is true. Almost every scientist presupposes physicalism/materialism. Why? Because physicalism/materialism was so astonishingly successful, and it's basically the bread and butter of scientific exploration, methodological naturalism. The problem is you wind up against a dead end that can only be solved by presupposing mathematical axioms, which is Gödel's incompleteness theorem in a nutshell. You have to presuppose the mathematical axiom in order to use the mathematical axiom. So X is a necessary precondition of Y, right? The reason why Gödel needed to do that was because math almost got taken out of the realm of, there was a real crisis in math. I think I didn't really fully explain this yet. Bertrand Russell noticed that true by definition, the liar's paradox could be applied to sets. And I forget the exact formulation, but you can say like, exactly what I said the liar's paradox is, if I say this statement is false, okay, your brain can explode just thinking about it. Am I lying? If I'm lying, the statement is true, therefore false. You can, I swear to God, it's who's on first for the intelligentsia. It can make you crazy just to think about it too much. So I don't advise thinking about the liar's paradox too much. But the liar's paradox can be applied to set theory, and therefore you have mathematics that can't be proved. And it created a real crisis in mathematics, like a real one. That's where Gödel's incompleteness theorem was born from, trying to ground mathematical truths in something other than true by definition. Why? Because true by definition can fail, as I just explained with the liar's paradox. So he's trying to ground mathematical truths in something other than. Now, why is this important for the theist proving the sky fair? Because you have two categories of reality. Okay, you have the material world, which atheists, are enamored with. The material world, Craig, is all there is. Brain, there's no mind. Brain, material world. And they point to the success of the physical sciences as somehow evidence for their position, except the success of the physical sciences has reached a backstop. Why has physical sciences been so successful? Because it's really easy, reductive materialism, to reduce everything to just strictly physical properties. You get a lot of information from it, and that's where the scientific revolution was born from. There are two glaring exceptions. And the two glaring exceptions are the exceptions that decimate the rule. The hard problem of consciousness. Now, there are those who say, and this is why metaphysical a priori assumptions are so really important. To this day, there are physicalists who don't even see the hard problem of consciousness. They try and argue against its reality. They say it's not a real problem, it's a pseudo-problem. But the problem is all of the physicalist arguments for physicalist philosophy of mind are pseudo-arguments. All of them. I don't have time to list them in the videos, but every one I've ever heard is a pseudo-argument. Really, really weak sauce. The reason why they're so compelling to the person who are usually really intelligent people is because they start with the presupposition firmly in their brain, physicalism/physical, reductive physicalism, the eliminative materialism. They start with that presupposition, so they only find what they're looking for. It's the same reason Pine Creek Doug's questions are borderline irrelevant. Why? Because he only asks you questions to point you back to his foregone conclusion. If you start with a physical, metaphysical a priori assumption that is too strong and resolute, you never completely investigate. So the things are going to, it's the same problem that happens to a young earth creationist. And the genesis of the problem, I think, is the same. Because you think something is true, and you aren't asking whether it is robust and defensible and can be justified, which is the bread and butter of evidentiaryism. Is it robust, defensible, can it be justified? If you ask if it's true, that's misleading. Why? Because the same reason that a young earth creationist thinks young earth creationism is true is they think it's true. So they start with that as a foregone conclusion, a metaphysical a priori assumption about how the world works. Therefore, every evidence contrary to it gets downgraded, and every piece of evidence in support of it gets magnified by 100. It's the same problem if you start as a physicalist, materialist, and you start analyzing the problems in philosophy of mind. Everything that supports physicalism / materialism, all the arguments, which are pseudo-arguments, I promise, the couple of famous ones that people probably know, the folk intuition one, is ridiculous. It's an argument ad populum in reverse. It's not even worth talking about. It's such a bad argument. It's the basic logic of the argument is this. A lot of people believe intuitively that phenomenal consciousness is a real thing, something like that. Therefore, it's false. Why? A lot of people are stupid and they believe things like astrology. I swear to God, that's the argument. It's not one piece of evidence in favor of physicalism. There's no such thing as a piece of supporting evidence in favor of physicalism. There are pseudo-arguments by people who don't do philosophy very much, so they're bad at it. Swear to God, I promise. If you don't believe me, I'll make videos just on that topic alone. But the point is, well, where was I? Where was I with the other thing? So physicalism / materialism. The point is that I was just making, well, what was I talking about? I just lost my train of thought. The pseudo-arguments in philosophy of mind, because they start with the metaphysical a priori assumption that physicalism / materialism is true. Just like when the young earth creationist starts with the presupposition firmly embedded in their brain that the earth is 6,000 years old. Therefore, every piece of evidence contrary to the presupposition is downgraded as relevant, and every piece of supporting evidence in favor of the presupposition is magnified by 1,000 in terms of its clarity, its meaning. Ditto for someone who starts as a physicalist / materialist, examining in philosophy of mind. Same basic thing going on, same basic paradigm. They start with that presupposition, so every piece of evidence that says that the hard problem of consciousness is real, phenomenal consciousness does seem irreducible to strictly physical properties. Every piece of evidence in favor of that, they downgrade in relevance, and every piece of evidence in favor of brain and mind is the same thing. They upgrade, they magnify times 1,000. Same idea. It's a young earth creationist in a different camp, basically. What they're doing is they aren't examining the evidence. They are examining the evidence with their bias firmly in place. It's called motivated reasoning. People do it all the time. It's common to human beings. The reason why the scientific process is so powerful is it upends that. Why? Because you have a methodological naturalism of parsing that out and correcting for biases so that you could find out that the facts are just facts. But human nature being what it is, the power of, we've got so much out of physicalism / materialism, let's make that our God, more or less. Let's make that answer everything. That's scientism in a nutshell. It's been so astonishingly successful, it's been so astonishingly powerful, that we don't need philosophy, metaphysics anymore. We barely need math. Math's a fiction. Why? Because we have science, physicalism and science. And once those two tent poles are shattered and proven false, which they will be, going to be a lot less atheists around. Why? Because those undergird a lot of atheists, the mental map of the world. If you dig into what they presuppose in order to become atheists, those are two big ones. Those are the two most common ones. And when you decimate them, which they will be decimated, we're trending away from the metaphysics of no metaphysics. That's starting to disappear. I might be running out of time. Let me check the video. That's starting to disappear. Again, I'm not making an argument. God exists. I didn't make an argument for God. Well, I kind of did with math, but you don't have to listen to that yet. Keep your tithes in your pocket. Keep your tithes sheathed. Joe, how am I doing? Smashingly good, Craig. Can I have your tithes yet? Oh, I think I'll hold down to the tithes temporarily, but you really nailed it. Can I have the tithes, please? I think I'll keep my tithes temporarily. You're really nailing it, though, Craig. I promise. But not quite won over by the metaphysics of math just yet. Okay, so not quite won over just yet. The only thing to keep in mind with the metaphysics, it doesn't really matter. I'm putting this out in the cold light of day so that everybody can debunk as you will, as I go. Why? Because there's nothing you can do. If I build an argument that works, end of discussion, game over. It's not really all that, it's important to me, but it's not, there's nothing you can do about it. You can't object to things that are basically true. The transcendental argument is a really powerful tool of inference. That's true. And it can be misused, sure. But when it's used properly, it's powerful. It is a new tool in the toolkit that is being underutilized by the theist community. That's important. Hold on to that. Why? Because that's really important. That's really important. How do you come to know the things that you know? Most people make automatic, metaphysical, a priori assumptions on the world based on the sense data. That's what they do. And then they plug in the sense data into the metaphysical priors. And if the metaphysical priors are off, you can't see past them normally. Just like a young earth creationist has a lot of trouble parsing out the data from a different point of view, so does the physicalist / materialist have a lot of trouble parsing out the data from outside of the worldview firmly embedded. That's the point. That's the problem. You have to get at that problem to flip the priors before you even do your dazzlingly brilliant argument for God. Before you even present my dazzlingly brilliant argument for the resurrection is going to blow them away. First of all, it probably won't. It probably won't. Pretty sure you're not going to be introducing anything new to the table other than what Trent Horn, that's about as good as that argument can be presented as far as I can tell. And just take a look at how it lands. Look at how little it actually moves the needle. Does it ever get an atheist to question? Does it realistically, does it get an atheist to question anything? I don't think so. That's why I said, how you get the people to flip priors is, it's not complicated, it's obvious, but Christians aren't really doing a lot of it yet. Atheists are doing it because they're running propaganda pieces. The favorite go-to argument in the atheist community is a propaganda piece, and that's it. That's it. It's the favorite one, the one that used to be the most common was, here's a challenging scripture in the Old Testament, from which you are going to draw in inferences that don't logically follow or automatically applied. Why? Because the challenging scripture in the Old Testament is irrelevant. To what? To the proposition God exists. There could be a challenging scripture in the Old Testament, I'll give you that. Smash their heads against the stones. Really challenging, Craig. Yeah, it's really challenging. It's so immoral. It seems immoral. How can you, the inferences that they automatically start drawing in don't logically follow. Therefore, God does not exist. That doesn't follow. Both things can be true at the same time. Therefore, Christianity is false. That doesn't follow either. The only thing it could potentially be used to debunk is inerrancy, or a literalist interpretation of the Bible. If you're not a literalist, you don't have to worry about it. Why? Because you didn't write the Bible. It's an argument that will eventually disappear. So if you're an atheist and you're psyched about how much hay you draw from that argument, don't be psyched. Why? Eventually that argument's going to disappear. Why? Because it's irrelevant. It's not a relevant data point. Here's a data point that's not relevant at all. What? To the proposition God exists. From which I'm going to truck in all these goofy inferences that don't logically follow. There's things that, there are inferences, the reason why the planting of seeds is so powerful is that the inferences that people draw logically follow and automatically apply whether you want them to or not. So let's take an example. You're at Vons with your wife and you're shopping. You ever see one of these things where you wince inside because you see a woman yelling at a kid in public and something inside of you breaks because you're like, God, if that's what she's willing to do in public, God help that poor kid when nobody's around. That's a normal logical inference that's almost always going to be correct. Why? Because people, generally speaking, are much better behaved in public than they are behind closed doors. So if that's how she's willing to treat her kid in public, God help that poor kid when nobody's looking. That's a normal inference. You could be wrong on that, but it usually automatically, logically follows. Almost everything you infer from interacting with another human being, when you pick up things about them, those are usually right. Those are usually right. Why? Because people can't hide. The things that you perceive, that you actively perceive by your interaction with someone, you usually develop inferences, okay? Developing of inferences is automatic. You do it all the time. We automatically presuppose things based on whatever somebody says. We automatically plug into metaphysical a priori in order for the thing to make sense. Just like I told you with my wife, you want something from Vons. I wouldn't even question it, whether there's a Vons there. I wouldn't bother going to look up whether there's a Vons in the town. Why? It's the only way the question makes sense to me. I would now presuppose that there's a Vons in where I say she was, Pacific Palisades, that I didn't know about. So metaphysical a priori assumptions are a powerful tool of inference, and they're how people formulate everything they believe. Almost everything. And the way they get formulated is propaganda in the planting of seeds. So, I think I'm running out of time, but I think I already said this one, but I'll say it one last time. If I were charged with convincing Luke to become a Republican, a conservative Republican, okay, I would get my 4 most reasonable Republicans I could find, the people who he'd like the most, and I'd tell them, never bring up politics, certainly never mention Trump. Never mention Trump, ever. And I'd tell him, pal around with him, and let him draw the inferences. Okay, Republicans don't bear fangs. They don't have horns growing out of their head. They're normal, just like me people. That's the first inference that he'd automatically get. That's basically why I can hang out with every group under the sun. Why? Because that's my starting point. I don't think any differently about atheists by virtue of the fact that they're atheists, ever. I meet them and see how they act. And if they're douchebag clowns, I go, look, there are a lot of atheists who are douchebag clowns. That's not something that I invented about atheists prior to investigating them. That's something I experienced. Well, there's a lot of them that are clowns. There's also a lot who are normal and cool. I only judge people on how they act towards me. That's it. That's why I get along with so many different people in the real world. It's easy to do if you don't have presuppositions about people. It's really easy to do. But if I were trying to get them to convince Luke to become a Republican, I'd say, don't ever talk about Trump. Don't ever talk about anything controversial. Just pal around with him. That's what they do in a more manipulative version. They call it love bombing in a cult. What's the love bombing? It's you get them to identify with you and interact with you, and then you start to become mysteriously more convincing to them. Once they start to identify with you. That's really it. When you start to identify with somebody, the things that come out of their mouth make a lot more sense. Why? Because you're starting to see the parallels between you and them. You're starting to develop a commonality with them. You start to notice, hey, that person's just like me. That's why they didn't like it when I got Drew on my channel. I guess that's why people don't like it. People weren't following because they didn't realize how revolutionary it was. How they just on the channel and just chat with the guy. Find out what makes him tick. It's revolutionary, Craig. Yeah, treat him like a normal person. Wow, revolution. It kind of was revolution. That's the sad part. Like I said, some of this is politics. Not 1 minute of it needs to be politics. Why? If I'm right, you want me to prove it to you. If you're an atheist. And if you're right, don't got to worry about it. Why? I'm smart enough. Eventually, I'll piece it together. I really am. I'm smart enough that if you're right, the atheist, I've been poking around in atheist land for a long time. Eventually, I'll just go, hey, wait a minute. What? I got no evidence for my Skyfair. I better pack it in. Nobody's giving me any ties, Craig. Give it up. All right, I quit. I quit. Do you see? I mean, I get that I said a lot of different things, but a lot of these things are really insightful, guys. That's why I keep blabbing away. Why? Because I'm nailing it. I'm telling you stuff that you're not going to hear anywhere else. That's really, 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 really important to how this all works. If I were charged with trying to convince Luke to become a Republican, I would get the 4 most reasonable, coolest Republicans I could find. One of them a hot chick. I assume Luke is straight. Luke, are you straight? I think so. I assume a hot girl who's really nice, and I tell them, don't ever bring up Trump. Don't ever bring up anything find out what his real, most people have a real freaking hot button. They call them the wedge issues in politics. They have them in atheist land too. The thing that if you touch on that, they go, and their head falls off. That's the thing that's really motivating. That's the real locus of motivation. That's the one that you gotta be careful of. I call it the third rail in politics. Don't step on that one. Why? Because they'll bite your head off. That's when the atheist starts atheisting. Okay, a lot of atheists seem cool and reasonable until you say that one thing. It's not as much true of atheists, actually, believe it or not. It's really true of left-wing people. My family, forget it. My sister in particular, Marietta, I apologize for bringing you up, but you're a really good example. She can be really, really cool and reasonable about something. You get the wrong button pushed, and all of a sudden she's lecturing and haranguing you about the injustices of X, Y, PDQ, and you want to kill yourself. You notice that with left-wing people, right? You say the wrong thing and you trigger something inside of them, and all of a sudden they're haranguing you about the injustices of this marginalized community, X, Y, Z, PDQ, and you want to kill yourself. Republicans do that too. Actually, my wife can do that on the other end. She can. If you get her, you get her. But I know where all the hot buttons are, so I can really easily avoid getting her to harangue me about it, whatever. I swear to God. Both sides do it. Christians and atheists do it. Every tribalism, dogmatism, every defect you've ever associated with Christianity and said this is by virtue of religion. It's a totally fake premise. Why? All groups do it. All groups do it all the time automatically. It's called human nature, and we all participate in it. Nobody has a monopoly on, the goofball clowns in their own tribe. Christians are not inherently more dogmatic and more tribal than atheists, than Republicans and Democrats, and anybody under the sun. And there's nothing in particular about Christian dogma that tends to breed that more than anything under the sun. How do I know that for a fact? Because a lot of people ignore Christian dogma and teaching half the freaking time. Oh, yeah. Oh, I didn't notice that. Well, you should. If Christians were following the teachings, they'd be loving, kind, nice, compassionate. They'd be imitating Christ, and they'd be like, the good guys in your neighborhood. They conveniently ignore half the Bible half the freaking time. Everybody noticed that, right? Okay, Republicans are no different. It's one thing I noticed when I started getting to know a lot of them by virtue of my wife. There's a lot of inconsistencies in there. A lot. There used to be such a thing as a cookie-cutter Republican. There isn't anymore since Trump happened. But there used to be such a thing as if you told me you were a conservative Republican, I could get your views with 90% accuracy. I could tell you what you thought about this issue, this issue, this issue. There isn't anymore. Trump upended that. He really did. So now it could be a populist Republican. There's a lot of different shades of Republicans now. The point is, nobody's got a monopoly on groupthink. Even atheists, which is really ironic and weird. Why? Because you would think that would be the one group that should, because they heavily value something that ostensibly cuts against that. Critical thinking and evidence-based conclusions. Therefore, it is completely inconceivable, and yet it happens that you find atheists who are dogmatic and don't look at the evidence. Inconceivable, right? Yeah, it's really common, though. Yeah, it's inconceivable, Greg. Why? Because their entire worldview is predicated on not being like that, and yet here we are. And there they are. And they're exactly like that. That's why a lot of people quit atheism. Why the irony is more than they could handle. The irony of that fact was more than they could handle. There's only so many times that you could be confronted with a guy who's bragging about his critical thinking skills and never using them. Before you're like, wait, I give up. These guys are ridiculous. So anyways, yeah, rambling. I don't know. That's the fun part when I start rambling. That's why I always keep going and then I make the video too long. Yeah, the video's already too long. All right, so I'll wrap it up. It was fun. I think I was clear I think everything I said on the Kant refutation of empiricism, I'm pretty sure that was all clear. It might have been a little jumbly, might have been a little bit chaotic. This is the first couple of times I'm bringing that stuff into the table. So usually with my videos, it gets processed out, and as I start talking about it more, I start becoming more clear and bring more focus. But there's a really good avenue of exploration there. The long and the short of it is, if you're a Christian apologist, don't neglect the Transcendental Argument. Don't have to use it to prove God. Relax on that. Relax. Deep breaths, Christians. Don't have to use it to prove God. Just think about how it applies in all different types of situations. A lot of times there is a necessary precondition for X is a necessary precondition for Y therefore X. You draw inferences like that all the time, and they're usually correct, and oftentimes they're correct, and they logically follow, and they automatically apply. So it's a powerful tool that has been all but neglected in the Christian community. It is a really powerful tool of inference. So pick it up and use it. Think about the things you think about. Think about how you came to the conclusions you came. And think about possible ways of evidencing things outside of just strict evidentiarism, because that's what it was born out of. What Kant called the synthetic a prioris. I guess I've got to wrap it up before I go into the synthetic a priori. But there were two categories according to Hume. Kant's refutation of Hume, which was 100 years before we ever started doing apologetics. He already dealt with some of the things that Matt Dillahunty is talking about today. That's the point. That's really why I say Kant had to be clear. Why? Because if he were clear, then people would be using his arguments a lot more. It's notoriously hard to understand. Just the synthetic a priori. Probably people don't even understand what that means. Called himself a transcendental idealism. It's a little confusing what he meant by that. Because ostensibly it was a refutation of idealism. Yeah. Kant was notoriously hard to understand. Otherwise, people would have picked up his arguments and used them a long time ago. Why? Because they are basically answers to a lot of the things you hear from the atheist community. There isn't just matters of fact and relations of things. There is also, this is why I latched onto math. Why? Because math has a firmer grounding than just relation of things. It needed one. It had to be grounded in it had a robust justification for mathematical axioms other than just empirical investigation. Once you start entering the realm of robust justifications for things outside of the empirical, hello, do you understand why that's important as a Christian? Do you understand why that's important as a Christian? You are robust justification for something outside of the realm of empirical. Circle, material world. Square, invisible, immaterial, transcendent realm. Bridge, math. Get it? The circle has already been squared. If the atheist doesn't accept that, we polish it up into a good argument and then force it into Stephanie. Force it into your face. Take that humble pie. Pow! Right in your stupid little face. Thank you, Stephanie. Good girl. Pow! Take that humble pie. Stick it right in your face. You get it? All right, maybe it wasn't that clear, but whatever. I'll wrap it up. 50 minutes. I think it was okay in this particular video, but we'll keep going with it. I'll get better at explaining it, and pretty sure everyone's going to get it by the end of a few months or so. So, there you have it, kids. That is all for now. Mass is ended. Go in peace. Amen.